Well, my body lies over the ocean. My body lies over the sea. Ooh, my body lies over the ocean. Oh, bring back my body to me. Bring back, oh, bring back my
Welcome
body.
to the Scott Arizala Show, presented by camphacker.org. My name is Travis Allison. We're so excited to have Scott be a part of the Camp Hacker Network and to be able to present to you his new show. Scott, I want to say hello. How's it going with you?
Hey, Travis. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone who's tuned in to the Scott Arizala Show.
It's going to be awesome. We wanted to really provide a space, Scott, that you could share some of the great stories and insights that you are so well known for. And you and I met while speaking at different conferences and keep running into each other on the road. And you've also been a part of the podcast, and we're really grateful for that. But we really wanted to make sure that the great stories, the good presentation, the insights that you have get out to more people than just those who can come see you at conferences. So we're excited to have you be part of the Camp Hacker family and to start this new show with you.
Thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to do this. I'm excited to be able to talk about different ideas, challenges, issues that all of us in camping are facing over the next few weeks with you, Travis. I'm really excited about this. So today's show, actually, we are going to talk a little bit about some trends in camping and about some special needs and what's going on in sort of that world in camping.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. So why don't you take it away, Scott?
For me, one of the big ideas about kids with special needs is really about this idea of kids with different needs, and it's also about perspective, which is a sort of a big piece when it comes to working with kids with different kinds of needs. And I'm reminded of a story about a couple summers ago. I rolled up on a game of Duck, Duck, Goose, and this was in a session that I was running for kids with autism. And I rolled up on this game, and right when I got there, the ducker sort of freaked out and had a meltdown. And if you've ever, been around kids who have ever played Duck, Duck, Goose before, you know that the ducker is not normally the one who has the meltdown or freaks out. And so it was a little bit different. So I sort of, right when I got there, this kid kind of runs away. I sort of follow him so the other counselors and the other kids can continue their game. And he doesn't go very far, and he sort of sits down and he's crying and he's huffing and puffing, and I sort of sit down with him and I kind of let him calm down a little bit, and I'm asking him, so what happened, man? What was going on? And he looks at me and he says, Scott, they were all yelling at me. Even the counselors were yelling at me. And I said, why? Why was everyone yelling at you? And he said, well, they all wanted me to choose a goose. And, I'm kind of looking at him like, well, yeah, man, like, weren't you playing Duck, Duck, Goose? And he looked at me like totally exasperated and was like, Scott, why would I choose a goose? And I'm like, what are you talking about, dude? Like, weren't we playing Duck, Duck, Goose? Like, what are you talking about? So I'm like, well, I mean, that's how you play the game, you duck, duck, goose. And he says, but I wanted to play a game that everybody could play. And if I, chose a goose, then it would be just me and this other kid playing Duck, Duck, Goose, and that wouldn't be fun for everybody else. And Travis, I'll tell you, it blew my mind. I seriously had to, take a step back because I was like, it was one of those moments that I had where what I realized in that moment was both for me and him, and of course the other kids and the counselors, we weren't sharing the same perspective. Because I said, well, of course, and you're absolutely right. In fact, the game that you're describing does sound much more fun. But nobody else came up to this game and wanted to play Duck, 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 Duck. Everybody else wanted to play Duck, Duck, Goose. And you had this idea about wanting to play a game with everybody. And so what I think we should do is go back and tell the rest of the kids and the staff that, hey, can we play a different game where everybody's able to participate? That's a great idea. They just weren't seeing it the same way, and we sort of had to have this conversation in that moment. And what it brought to me in that moment, and of course, I think in a wider way, is that what we need to do as adults working with kids, any kids, specifically kids that have some sort of different kind of need, is to try and get on the ground and understand that perspective. How are they seeing it? How are they viewing it? And what's sort of important sort of in that moment to that kid? And this kid was pretty verbal, and had the staff really explicitly talked a little bit more about what some of the expectations are and asked a few more questions, they might have understood what was going on. And I'm not necessarily advocating that staff, do this in every moment. I mean, this was just an innocent game of duck, duck, goose that sort of quickly unraveled and got out of control for this one kid. But that perspective that kid had of wanting to play a game with everybody and having the staff and the other kids not really understand and, yelling at him, quote unquote, was just really interesting to me, and it brought to light sort of that piece about working with kids with different kinds of needs.
And Scott, I've always worked at a camp integrated with special needs kids and adults, and they were integrated long before we got there. And I've always liked that different perspective that you get from working with people with different abilities, and how that changes how you think about summer camp. And I was wondering, what are some of the other things you want to talk about the value of working with kids with special needs at camp?
Well, I mean, I think, the reality is that all of us, no matter what kind of camp you run, or, you're faced with kids who have very different needs. Whether you put yourself out there like that and say, hey, we accept everybody, whether you're like me and you actually run a camp that is specifically for kids with X, Y, or Z, or you're running just a typical camp, and we all know, we've all been there, where we have, hey, we're running a camp for typical kids, and guess what? We have 3, 4, 10, 20 kids who come who have clearly something going on with them, and nothing shows up on the health form. So I think the reality is that we're dealing with something that's happening for everybody, no matter kind of what kind of camp you run. And so I think it's sort of behooves all of us professionals to be able to say, hey, it's something we need to pay close attention to, as far as giving our staff the resources to be able to handle any kid that comes to our camps.
Well, what do you recommend then, Scott, for those kids that show up whose parents haven't disclosed any special needs, but for whom it's obvious that they have different abilities than the other kids who are there?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, it's about, using all the sort of tried and true techniques of a great camp counselor, right? I mean, asking good questions, really carefully listening, paying attention in a way that generates interest. I mean, I think one of the hardest things to do as a camp counselor is to stay interested. I mean, just straight up, I don't care what kid you're talking to. Sometimes it's really hard to stay interested. The reality is as a camp counselor, sometimes you've got 4, 6, 8 years on some of these kids. And, what a 12-year-old is interested in and talking about isn't always that interesting. And so to sort of maintain that level of interest by, again, exercising all those great camp counselor skills, that to me is sort of your number one strategy. It sort of speaks to, sometimes people ask me, because of my background, because of what I'm doing with my camps, will you come and do a specific training for our staff who work with kids with special needs? And absolutely I will. What's interesting though is oftentimes 75-80% of that content is for the most part exactly what I would do to come and do a training at anybody's camp for any kids. I mean, most of it's the same. Sometimes how you express it is differently. If you're working with a kid who, let's say, nonverbal, the sort of expressions of how you get a kid familiar with the processes and procedures of camp, familiar with the expectations of camp, is clearly going to be different than a typical kid who's verbal and whatever. I mean, sort of the expression of that might change, but the core concept, the core principle is exactly the same. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's in how you use those tools. I think it's in how you pay attention. I think it's in the things that you notice. Let me give you a quick example. For a lot of kids with autism, one of the sort of best practices that everyone talks about is to sort of understand what their thing is. A lot of times you hear people talk about sort of motivational motivational things is not as articulate as I want to be, but for some kids it's trains, some kids are into bugs, some kids are into processes, systems, how things work. I've even talked to kids who are into the short production company videos that happen before movies start. The 3-second thing that Pixar does where the eye, the lamp is jumping and becomes the eye. They're into different kinds of things, and to find out what those are, to use those as motivational sort of pieces to say, we can get your cards out, if we sit down with kids and go through the group activity. What's interesting to me, though, is, again, that's not really any different than working with any kid. Finding out what they're interested in, finding out what they're engaged in. It looks different and sounds different if you're working with a kid maybe with autism, or a kid with some sort of attention deficit, or a kid who maybe has a medical, more physical issue. Those sort of principles don't necessarily change. It's sort of how you use them that might look or sound or feel different.
3 Adventures International Camp Staff.
3 things you should know about 3 Adventures. 1. Our owners are all former camp directors. 2. We're a high-quality company that's easy on your budget. 3. Background checks. Our international camp staff come from all over the world, and every one of them has had a background check. No exceptions, no excuses. 3adventures.com, the site to get great camps connected with great staff.
Well, a big part of any counselor's job, and really specifically a director's job, is learning to deal with parents. And parents of kids with special needs have had to learn over time to be very assertive about what their child needs in order to continue their development. And that parent is the only one responsible for how that child does in education, at a camp, etc. And I wonder, for you, Scott, what's your best advice for counselors who then deal one-on-one with these parents who can come off sometimes quite bossy? In their defense, they are used to being that one to stick up for their kid, and no one else will. So how do you advise counselors to deal with them?
Well, there's a couple things you need to understand about parents. First of all, we're all crazy. I don't care if our kid is typical or not. When it comes to our kids, we're all just absolutely nuts. And I think you have to sort of understand that and take that as sort of your first understanding about all parents. When it comes to parents with kids who have any kind of different need, I think one of the things, and you sort of touched on it, Travis, one of the things that you have to understand is oftentimes these parents are these kids, their kids' only advocate. They're fighting around every corner to get their kids appropriate services, appropriate resources, appropriate support. Whether that's sitting in IEP meetings, whether that's fighting with school boards and school districts, or community resource organizations. So often is the case, and this is tragic, but so often is the case that it's not easy to navigate these kinds of fields. So when a parent comes to you, they're sort of used to the fight, and they're used to making sure that all kids get sort of the most or the best experience, and that framework doesn't go away for them just because they found themselves at summer camp. I think understanding that first and foremost is crucial for camp counselors, because I think that takes away some of the edge. Sometimes, and parents, you're absolutely right, Travis, they can come off bossy, they can come off rude, they can come off as if you don't have their kids' sort of best interest at heart. And I think that's where you need to assume the best of them and sort of take all of that in and understand that they absolutely are the sort of expert in the room when it comes to their particular kid. Just that assumption alone, right? If you can approach as a 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old, if you can approach a parent with that kind of assumption at the start, it'll disarm a lot of the conversation. And you'll find yourself appreciating more what's coming off of those parents and taking on some of those ideas and suggestions. I think the other thing that camp counselors need to also understand, though, and this is almost going to sound contradictory, is that all the other adults then that work with a lot of kids with special needs or different needs, their entire framework is typically around that special need, right? So again, let's take a kid who has autism, for example. Well, the aide that works in the autism support classroom with that particular kid, their whole education and their sort of entire framework is about working with a kid with autism. Their best practices, whether it's applied behavioral therapy, whatever it is great. That works for them. We're at summer camp, though. We're doing things in an entirely different framework, and I think that's something that we need to appreciate. A lot of times kids get to camp and they're given some leeway and they're experiencing things in a totally different way, and I don't want camp counselors to sort of lose that framework. So you're working at a typical camp, you get a kid who's either doesn't have a diagnosis anywhere on his health form, so you had no idea what's coming at you, or does, and you have some sort of framework in your head like, wow, this kid's got attention deficit or hyperactivity or autism or Asperger's or whatever it is, doesn't matter. I think one of the things that we need to sort of appreciate is our framework is summer camp. Our framework is fun and recreation sort of at its core, along with all the different sort of values and ideas and understandings that we have at summer camp. That in and of itself can be very liberating, I think, for a lot of kids, because you're going to be one of the very first adults who isn't sort of seeing a kid in that kind of framework and saying, hey, your job is to be here and have fun. Your version of fun might be different than the next kid's, and that's fine. How can we make that happen?
Scott, have you ever done anything with your staff to give them perspective of what it's like to have special needs? Certainly autism spectrum disorder, your perception of the world is completely different than those who don't share those unique abilities. Have you done anything to give your staff member a feel for what that's like for those campers? Yeah.
There's a number of interesting training techniques that I think we've employed. One of the most interesting ones was specifically with autism, and I'll get into a couple other interesting training activities that I've done in the past. But specifically with autism, one of the more interesting ones we've done is you can go on YouTube and you can find videos on anything, right? Yes. But you can find some really interesting sort of monologues from folks, from typically adults, sometimes kids, with autism that sort of break open that perspective and sort of what they're thinking about and how they're thinking about it. A video that I've seen, and if I can dig up the resource, I certainly will, and I'll have Travis posted on the website. But one of the most interesting ones I saw was an adult who was talking about growing up with autism and simply the game It, and how that confused him for years. Because if you think about the game It, or Tag even, it's sort of contradictory as far as the sort of social cues, and it's like, it's good to be it, but you're running away from being it, like you want it, but you don't want it. I mean, it's a really sort of conflicting kind of idea if you really break it down, but it was how he was talking about it which sort of broke open this idea of perspective. To give our staffs a little bit more of an idea, an interesting activity that we've done in the past is we've had what we sort of framed as sort of a disability meal, where what we did is on the way into the dining hall, we sort of assigned out different physical disabilities for individuals as they walked in. Some people, got a sleeping mask that they put on so that they, couldn't see during the meal. Other people had hearing, earplugs and then hearing protection over the earplugs, so they really couldn't hear anything. Other folks, we had them only use their non-dominant hand. Other folks, we had a whole bunch of wheelchairs, and we had people be wheelchair users while they were in the dining hall, trying to navigate the dining hall and get their tray of food and all that kind of stuff. Other folks we didn't let speak. So it was really interesting to then after that whole meal, we would just have the open conversation. So what was that like? How was it? How was it difficult? Was it difficult asking for help? Was it difficult, sort of navigating the dining hall, only using your non-dominant hand? What about not being able to say anything, like not being able to participate in the conversation at the meal? What did that feel like? Just so I have that conversation, and I think what it does is it gives it gives staff the perspective of what it feels like to be challenged in some kind of way.
Yeah, that's really cool, and great to open their eyes and give them some perspective. What are some of the things that counselors have said to you that they got out of that experience?
The first and foremost thing that people talk about is this idea of sort of isolation. I think immediately people talk about sort of feeling like the other, feeling different, which is, sort of what you would expect, right? I mean, this sort of feeling of I didn't fit in, or somehow I needed to ask for help, but it was kind of awkward. There's obviously this sort of sense of levity when you're doing an activity like this, because sort of everybody sitting around the table is experiencing something new. But I think that's probably the biggest takeaway for a lot of typical staff. What's interesting is at Dragonfly, my camp, we employ a lot of people with different kinds of either physical issues or developmental issues. And what's interesting is to have those folks talk about that experience right alongside of somebody who's experiencing for the first time what it's like to not be able to see while you're trying to eat, for example. Right. And I think that is a really interesting discussion, and I think it preps them to be more open to what I was saying earlier, sort of employing all those really good camp counselor skills. I think it makes them more open then to really digging for it in the short 5, 6, 7 days that we have with kids.
Yeah, great idea. Scott, do you have any other things in wrapping this up? Any other ideas that you have for camp staff? Things you want to talk about with them for working with campers with special needs?
I mean, I guess really, that's my sort of closing idea that I think is really important for all of us to have is I honestly believe, and you've heard me say it sort of throughout this whole time, I really honestly believe that as we push forward in the future of camping and as we move into working with all different kinds of kids, whether that's in a really special environment and we're really catering to a particular kind of kid or a kid who's dealing with a particular kind of issue, or we're at our typical camps and we're dealing with more and more kids that have some sort of different kind of need. I think it's less and less about focusing in on what that special need or different need is, and more about understanding that really every kid that comes to us has some sort of different need. And if we can reframe it like that and really think about it and deliver to our staff this idea that every kid is really different and every kid's going to need something different. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't care what we're teaching in staff training, if any one of our staff think that after listening to this bit on communication or this bit on homesickness or this bit on behavior management thinks that they have the tools, the one-size-fits-all technique that's going to work with every kid, then we've done them a disservice, right? We need to have them walking out feeling like, great, I've got this sort of range of different techniques and strategies and skills that now my job is to figure out each of these individual kids. And so if there is an issue, if there is a problem that a kid is facing, I'm going to be able to help guide that kid really in a really specific way for that particular kid. So that, I think, is maybe the big take-home message.
Thanks very much, Scott. I really appreciate your time, and it's great to have you on the Camp Hacker Network. Is there any anything you could give us to talk about what will be coming up on future shows?
Sure, yeah. I'm really excited about this. We have a bunch of great stuff planned. We're going to be doing a couple of different series. I want to do a series on communication and a lot of different issues there. I want to do a series on behavior management and talk about a lot of different ideas in behavior management. Of course, we're going to talk about different things that are happening in staff training. And we'd also like to talk to professionals and what's going on in our world throughout the year, throughout the calendar year for camp professionals. So you guys can look forward to all of that. For more information on me, Scott Arizala, you can always go to my website at thecampcounselor.com. You can look at my book at smorethancamp.com. And of course, you can check out Travis and everything he does at camphacker.org.
Thanks very much, Scott.
All right, y'all. Thanks for watching.
Well, my body